Thank you. Well, when you have a panel this accomplished, it's impossible to do a complete bio because we only have 45 minutes. So a really short one, starting with Nathaniel Rich here, who is the author of Losing Earth, a finalist for the Wilson Literary Science Award and the winner of awards from the Society of Environmental Journalists, the American Institute of Physics. His second book, Second Nature, is long listed for the Wilson Award. Features the story Dark Waters, which was made into a major film starring Mark Ruffalo. He's also the author of novels King Zeno, Odds Against Tomorrow, a writer-at-large for the New York Times Magazine, and a frequent contributor to the Atlantic and New York Review of Books. He lives in New Orleans and teaches at Tulane. Nathaniel Rob Verchick, in the middle there, is a leading climate law scholar who designed and implemented climate resilience policies in the Obama administration. He holds the Gautier St. Martin Chair in Environmental Law at Loyola University. He's a senior fellow in the Disaster Resilience Program at Tulane University and serves as president of the Center for Progressive Reform, and has been especially concerned about climate effects on underserved populations. And our final guest over there is Jesse Keenan. Is the Favreau II Associate Professor of Sustainable Real Estate within the faculty of the School of Architecture at Tulane University. He's recognized as a world leader on the intersection of climate change adaptation and the built environment, on aspects of design, engineering, regulation, planning, and financing. His many books include Blue Dunes, Climate Change by Design, which is today's topic. So, as you can see, we have three different approaches to the climate crisis that's ongoing, and I think anyone who lives in New Orleans and recently got their insurance bills understands that it is happening. It's not something in the future. So let's start with Nat here, who happens to be, a wonderful writer who uses the tools of journalism to tell powerful stories revolving around climate change. Second Nature chronicles individuals struggling to make sense of the world changing around them, and some of those stories are set right here in New Orleans. In Losing Earth, Nat profiles scientists who tried to sound the alarm beginning almost 2 decades ago about the crisis that was approaching and were largely ignored, even denigrated. But it also includes closing and opening essays by Nat that frankly say the fight is over. The fossil fuel industries have won and terrible days are ahead for future generations. I'd like to know why, Nat, you chose that narrative vehicle to try to reach people with these stories.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a thrill to be here with all of you, and with Bob, whose pieces I read every week in the paper and are really a welcome corrective to the general trajectory of the editorial coverage. No, you don't need a comment in the paper. But I guess I would dispute that interpretation of the essays that frame Losing Earth. To take a step back, Losing Earth is a story of this decade from 1979 to 1989 that has all but been had been erased in the public memory, I found when I started writing about it, which was 2016 or so. It started originally as a story, sort of unusual story for the New York Times Magazine, that occupied an entire issue of the magazine. So I spent a long time researching it. I wanted to write about this period because 1979 is the date at which we can really pinpoint the moment of scientific consensus. We hear now this line about 99.9% of climate scientists agree that humans cause warming and all that. That was really that consensus forms by 1979. There's a series of events inside and outside the U.S. Government, in the academy, that crystallizes that. And starting in 1979, for about 10 years, you have this effort that originates with a handful of people. James Hansen, the NASA scientist, Rafe Pomerantz, who during the 1980s, this is hard for people to really understand, was essentially the only climate activist in the world, certainly in the US. Then Al Gore, a junior congressman, and a few other people in Washington primarily. And they started this effort to try to bring about a solution to the problem. And over the course of the decade, they had a lot of setbacks, and I tell the story in the book, but ultimately they got, by 1989, to the precipice of what was seen then as a solution, which was a global treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It was the first iteration of what's now, of the IPCC process. What the most recent iteration is the Paris Accords. Over the last 30 years, it's gotten diluted and weakened. But it's in its strongest form was presented in 1989. And there was a high-level meeting of diplomats. All of the environmental ministers, essentially in the world, came together and there was agreement about the wording. And at the last minute, the U.S. and several other countries, under their sway, bolted. And essentially, we've never been as close again. Shortly after that, you have this sort of hard political divide. And the story is also in part about how in the 1980s it wasn't a partisan issue yet. Democrats were generally more advanced on it, but there were a lot of major figures in the Republican Party who took it on as an issue. Anyway, I'm happy to go into that further, but I think to your question, I wanted to write about that period because it's a period before not only the politics shifted and the economic fight shifted and kind of froze in this paralysis that we've been in ever since. It was also a time when the narrative hadn't quite formed yet and hadn't hardened. And it was a moment of possibility, unlike anything we've come close to since. And so what's most dramatic to me about the story is the failure that happened even before this intense disinformation campaign of the oil and gas industry had kicked into high gear, even before the hard politicization of the issue. And it was a way of talking about not only the inherent problems in taking on this fight for global society, but also the sort of human problems that we have dealing with it, psychologically, socially, culturally, as a way to understand sort of the core of the problem before it became part of this larger debate. And so my point in the essays was simply, we blew it then. We've been in a frozen place since. I don't think we're doomed to a worst case scenario, though, and I think one of the great dangers we have, and we can talk about this more in the conversation, is to frame climate change as a win-lose battle. It's not a binary outcome. Certainly the best case scenarios that were available in 1979 are off the table, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a wide range of outcomes that we can control. It's not a great rallying point for a climate activist to say, like, let's go for the best case scenario that's still available, that's worse than what we could have had, but is much better than the alternatives. But that's, I feel like, where we're at. And so in my writing, I try to write about the issue and understand it in sort of realistic terms and try to understand more than anything the way in which this great public crisis is touching our own lives, in daily lives, but also our own sort of intimate lives, the way that we understand the world, the way that we understand our most fundamental relationships, and the way we think about the future. And so I write stories that try to examine those questions that arise out of this larger, complex problem.
One technique that really made the book really a fast read was how you got into the personalities of each of the people, the scientists especially. And they went from the beginning when they were discovering this stuff and finally going these aha moments that, well, it's been going on for a century, but this is really trouble. And they were charging off full of enthusiasm to get this done. And as the book goes on, they keep running into roadblocks. There's a point really during H.W.'s administration where all these Republicans even are saying, yes, we got to do this. And then it just falls off the cliff. So that was between 84 and 89.
Yeah, that's sort of the final act. I mean, what's fascinating to me about the stories of these people who, when the decade begins, are largely, mostly in their late 20s, early 30s, is when they become aware of the issue, I think they respond the way most of us do, certainly the way I do, which is simply to say, first disbelief, and then thinking, well, if it's this bad, surely someone is going to figure it out, someone in a position of power. And then when that doesn't work, they say, oh, well, we should tell the government, we should tell the White House, basically. And these people were perfectly positioned to do that. And they, I tell the story, they go to the top. They go in the Carter administration at first, where they have a receptive audience, and they say, there's this global existential threat that's coming right towards us. We should at least take some practical steps. And they slowly realize through this disillusionment that I think all of us have to some degree, that it's not enough to say that. It's not enough to show the science. It's not enough to bring a convincing argument. Something else is needed. And I think the thing that's needed, they weren't able to fully figure out in that decade. But I think we're figuring it out now.
Have you kept in touch with some of the main characters?
Yeah, I'm in pretty close touch with Rafe Pomerantz, who's really the central figure in the book, who discovers climate change in 1979, reading this obscure report about coal, a government report, and he's just shocked at what he's reading. And his story is really powerful to me, because in his story you see not just the political story, because he was basically the guy behind the scenes through this whole decade, pushing the politics until pushing it to the global stage, from his office originally in Friends of the Earth in DC. But he's sort of a direct access point to, I think, the emotional arc of the story, and I think of all of our story, which is that when he reads this coal report, his first thought is not of which administration official he should talk to. It's of his wife, Lenore, who at that point was, I think, 7 months pregnant with their first child. And he comes home and he tells her, and he says, if this is true, what are the ethics of bringing a child into this world where we know that a certain amount of warming and disruption and chaos is inevitable? And for me, that's the conversation that I think a lot of people are having now. Whenever I go around the country and have spoken about losing Earth, inevitably I get somebody says, usually a young person says, is it ethical to have a child? Or a would-be grandmother would say, or grandfather would say, my adult child has concerns about having children, given what we know and what we know about the trajectory. And for me, that's the beginning of a deeper, more emotional reckoning. That question stands for a whole host of questions about the ways in which this crisis is entering into our intimate lives. And I think that's where I've tried to direct my writing and my reporting.
Well, your closing essay, I think it's fair to say you're angry. You were.
Yeah, it's frustrating.
And, but you do leave one question, which I think is really the point of a lot of the book, and that the line is, what world do we want to create in its place?
Yeah.
You're concerned about the future, the habitability of Earth throughout. So what do you see happening?
Yeah, so that's my next, that's the book I wrote after is called Second Nature, which is a series of stories, and it's really about people asking themselves that question, ordinary people who are trying to navigate not only the sort of despair aspect of it, but the weirdness of where we're at in this moment in our relationship with the natural world, not just climate change, but once you come to understand the idea that there's no square inch of the planet that hasn't been reconfigured by human activity. There's nothing natural in the natural world anymore. Our imprint is on every square centimeter of land and cubic centimeter of the atmosphere. And so once you understand this enormous power that we've had over the environment, the follow-up question inevitably has to be, how can we use this power for good instead of just recklessly and haphazardly? And so I write stories about people who are trying to navigate that, and I write about the master plan here. I write about people who are trying to bring back extinct species like the woolly mammoth, people who are trying to create meat in a lab without killing any animals, a glow-in-the-dark bunny, which I won't go into it, but this is the bunny. And so it's about, coming to terms with some of the loss, but also coming to terms with the power and influence that we still have, and how do we, if we can't fully go back to the world as we found it, how can we create, in the world ahead of us, how can we bring forward the virtues and the qualities that we miss, that we mourn? How can we bring those into this new existence? In the case of Louisiana, in a swamp that we're creating south of the city, how do we, what is the best way to do it? What is the most moral way to do it? And what's the fairest way to do it? And those are very difficult questions as soon as you go, an inch under the surface. And that to me is where the most exciting and fascinating stories lie.
Okay, and Rob Verchick, your book might be more of a handbook for everyday citizens on how to adapt and maybe try to shape the future on an individual basis. Your octopus, I'm thinking of Louisiana. Octopus, right, in the parking garage. Can you tell us about that and the main thrust of your books, which seems to be a little more hands-on what you can do?
Yeah, sure. And I think that this whole concept of building climate resilience and adapting to climate change is really closely connected to what Nathaniel's talking about too. Because, and I tell my students, climate change is not a pass-fail exam, right? That's getting away from the binary part that you're talking about, right? There are lots of things that we can do to make our grade better as we go. Now, we missed a lot of chances, and there are some big issues that we got to face by 2100. We're going to be losing, if we don't do anything, we're going to be losing $500 billion a year in the U.S. economy by the end of the century, which is about as much as our economy expands in any given year. We may lose a sixth of the species. We may we're going to lose countless jobs, lives. People are going to get sick, all of these things. So one of the things we have to do is make ourselves and our ecosystems more resilient to those sorts of things. Because even if we shut all the lights off today and didn't burn another ounce of fossil fuel, we would be waiting 40 to 100 years to see the positive effects related to climate change around that, right? So that's why politicians don't want to do it, right? Because they want to say, oh, well, you're going to have to pay something now to reduce greenhouse gases, and in 40 to 100 years, we'll see a benefit, right? And so that's hard, right? That's really hard. So one of the things we need to do is start adapting to climate change in various ways so that we can buy more time, keep people from suffering now, and while we buy that time, our reductions in greenhouse gases will have a payoff for our next generation. And so what I write about is I start looking at, if you think in your own mind, anything you care about is going to be affected by climate change or already is in some ways. So I talk about wildfires, for instance, in the West, talk about coastal restoration. I did a lot of reading of your reporting on this in thinking about how to make coastal restoration fair, right? Looking at coral reefs, an interest of mine. I learned to dive many years ago and went scuba diving with citizen scientists and other scientists who are doing coastal restoration work in the Keys and other places, and I write about that. Talk a lot about the power grid, which has become very important given the federal funding that is now coming into utilities and elsewhere to attempt to expand the power grid, as Bill Gates was talking about a couple nights ago, and also make that power grid more resilient so it doesn't fail so much anymore. And what I found, you mentioned, well, what can citizens do? What's the citizen handbook? So one lesson is this. It's a multi-pronged approach, right? It's everyday people like you and me, it's government, it's big companies, all of these things, but we have a role in deciding how we do things. And so, for instance, I interview a number of people that have fascinating stories. One, Karen Norman, who at 15 years old was one of the only master scuba divers in the United States. She's from Key West, and She's participating in coral restoration projects, growing coral in offshore nurseries and replanting it. She's actually involved in peer review studies on coral health. She goes to her town meetings in southern Florida and testifies about coral health and about the effects that cruise ship traffic is having in certain areas. I follow Sharon Levine, an international hero at this point, the founder of Rise St. James and a Goldman Prize winner. I followed her after Hurricane Ida and rode around in her SUV as she was helping people recover from Hurricane Ida, moving ice and supplies and these sorts of things. She's a former special ed teacher from St. James Parish, and she had a unique set of skills, a really good communicator, a lot of respect from people in her community, a passion, a religious passion that moves into political realms, and she just took all of that and she's doing something with it. I interview a woman named Cynthia Zermenio Moore from Las Vegas, where I'm originally from. And she's really interested, she got interested in air pollution because she has a child who has asthma, and all that smoke from the wildfires in California were coming into her Latino neighborhood in Las Vegas. And so she got really interested in environmental justice issues. And right now, I talked to her this week, she is helping to lobby the state of Nevada for the first law that would protect workers in extreme heat. Think about this. I mean, this is Nevada. No law on the books protecting workers outside. And we're talking construction workers, people working as auto mechanics, garbage collectors, you name it. 115 degrees outside, several days in a row outside. And I tell you what, there are more deaths from heat illness in the United States. 700 or so people die every year from heat stress. That's 7 times more than people who die in a flood in the United States. 700 people die from heat stress every year in the United States. 70,000 people get sick from it. And it almost all affects disproportionately people of color. So these are the kinds of things, you might not even think of these things as adapting to climate change, and some of the people I interview don't. But if you dig below the surface, they're doing really, real important work to buy time so we can crank down heat-trapping gases.
Well then, Jesse, you come from a totally different angle, from the government, basically. Projects that only the government can do. Engineering, the built environment, and anyone who's reported on that and looked into it, everyone says, why don't we just build a darn sediment diversion or whatever. And it's a lot more complicated than that. You address this in this book and a lot of other books. Could you tell us about this book and what you're explaining to readers?
Well, listen, thank you for having me today. It's a great privilege, particularly with such distinguished panelists. And like Rob, a lot of us are in and out of the government and government work, and I think that speaks to the richness of our work and at least gives us an area of inquiry that perhaps defines the relevance of our work. Rebuild by Design is a really interesting initiative, that happens after Hurricane Sandy, where early on in the Obama years, there had been a lot of movement towards climate adaptation at an interagency level, but that work was being led by, let's say, the scientists in the group, not necessarily the national security people or people at OMB, the people with the money, for instance, and it was floundering in a way. And all of a sudden, we have a huge storm, which, by the way, it wasn't even a hurricane when it hit New Jersey, but it was a massive storm, $90 billion present value in losses at the time, and massive loss and social impact as well. This was an opportunity, as the Obama administration saw it, to stress test these ideas of climate change. Because in the United States, we are experts at a lot of different things, and one of the things we're supremely expert at is rebuilding after disasters. Whether we do it right or wrong or well, that's a whole other category of inquiry, particularly here in New Orleans, but we have a lot of experience in the cycle of disaster and disaster recovery. So the idea was, how do we take those institutions, those laws, the Stafford Act, and how do we take those institutions and manipulate them, modify them, revise them in a way that allow us to create and support, in this case, in New York, and what this book is about, is in the metropolitan region of New York, how do we take that those institutions and have some prototype projects that connect with a different set of variables and values, right? We think today about benefit cost analysis and really boring sort of econometric understanding of where we prioritize things, who are the winners and losers of climate change. It's all very dry in a way. This was, what are the new indicators? How do we think about social impact? What is the notion of distributional equity and who pays and who benefits? And infrastructure and social service and all of these things. So one of the projects that came up through this was completely different from all the others. It was at an infrastructural scale. It was the kind of, we talk about how do we scale up or how do we scale down? How do we take what's happening in community and scale this across the country in terms of the transition, the decarbonization? Well, this is a project, the Blue Dunes Project, that arises and it says, you know what, we're going to forego the conventional processes of HUD rules and all of that jazz, and we're going to try to build something big. We're going to build islands. We're going to put in massive scale wind farms offshore. This is predating any of the conversation and regulatory authorization that we have today for wind farms, for instance. And what do we get for that? And instead of going through the Army Corps of Engineers, which by the way, that's my other job, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we're going to work with insurance companies. We're going to work with applied downscaled climate modeling, more or less, to understand risk reduction in the language of average annual avoided losses. We're going to think at a different scale of value. And by the way, there's all kinds of ecological restoration and biodiversity opportunities that come along with this. And so the book is not just a how-to of how do you do this, how do you outline these really ambitious scaled projects. It's actually a conversation between scientists and designers, because there's not a technical fix to climate change. I always get annoyed when people say there's climate solutions. There's not really climate solutions. It's exactly what you all speak of, that binary, right? But what we have, and what we have to understand, rather, is that we need creativity. We need people that really can apply the tools of design, for instance. So it's a negotiation it's almost an epistemological negotiation between science and design, and engineering and the creative arts. And how do we understand culture and engineering hand in hand in the idea of the creation of not just a landscape, but a true place and a true blue economy? So that's what the book's about. And it's about the conflicts that arise as much as it's about the complementarity of the work. And I think that that's a really important lesson, because going forward, it's how we manage these conflicts that I think speak to our opportunities for collective action.
How do you speed that process along?
Well, I think we're doing it. Well, again, I wear multiple hats in and outside the government, but I want to say in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, we're gearing things up. And in fact, in the next 6 months, you're going to see a lot of regulations and guidance that are going to really accelerate our economy. And at the heart of this book, I think, is an argument about the economy and the opportunity here for job creation, right? We recognize that in the creation of these new islands, we're altering fisheries and marine economies in a way, but in ways that we felt like could be productive and help build a new workforce. So there's no short answer to that, but I think it is worth understanding that we are in that process now. Will we get there fast enough, right? No. But we're making massive progress. And I think we have not only new tools, but a new language. And I think that's what's important about this panel and this body of work and literature, is that we now, I think more so than ever, have a common language and a common understanding of not only the history of how we got here, but what it is that we need to understand to move forward.
Okay. Well, it's 10 minutes left. Time to open it up for questions. There are 2 microphones here and here. Mark Schlefstein.
Sorry, you have to be the guy to do it. So we live in New Orleans. We are at risk. We are facing the similar sorts of restrictions that the rest of the nation is facing, except we have a small population and not much power in Congress. How do we assure that New Orleans and this region will exist in ways that are useful through the next 50 years to 100 years.
I feel like we should invite you on the stage.
Yeah.
To fit another chair here.
Yeah.
The local authority on that question, global authority.
Well, as you bring that up, I'm reminded of Governor John Bell Edwards' climate change initiatives task force, which I serve on. So I'll just point out that one of the things that I'm heartened by is that in this state we now have an initiative where the state has promised, at least by executive order, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by net zero by 2050. That's stated in an executive order. It could be repealed with the next governor, but it's something that people really need to think about. Our task force is really hard at work trying to develop strategies that would not only reduce the footprint of greenhouse gas emissions in Louisiana, but also build up resilience. And one of the keys to getting more federal funding is being prepared for it and having really strong commitments so you can say, look, we're in it for the long haul, we're serious about adapting to climate change, and your money will go far, taxpayer, if it comes in this direction. That's not a panacea, of course, but it's a beginning. And if we don't hold on to that commitment in the next move of the governor's office in the next election, if we lose that commitment, we'll be back at square one again. And that is something we are in charge of.
The interesting thing about adaptation is there are thresholds of adaptation.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, we see maladaptation, failure, et cetera, but there's no amount of money that's going to solve the problems that define the vulnerability of New Orleans.
Can I just add one quick thing? I would say that there's a cover of your newspaper a couple years ago. That was a quote from this excellent Tulane scientist, and I'm worried I'm going to
Tornquist.
Tornquist. Yeah. The headline was "We're Screwed," and he studies sea level rise and the marsh. And I called him for a story I was writing then about the master plan, and I said, well, what about the master plan? Like, isn't that you're on? And he's like, well, yes, I'm an advisor on the master plan, of course. And I said, well, isn't that designed to, And he said, well, it's designed to buy us time, but it's not. Even in the rosiest scenarios, it's not going to prevent the Gulf from rising to Baton Rouge, more or less. And he said, there's a scenario in which New Orleans exists. If it exists, it exists as an island. Of course, technically maybe it is an island currently, but an island off in the Gulf of Mexico. And then he went into this thing that really stayed with me about maybe we should think of cities as having lifespans just like human beings. Maybe we should change the way we think about these things. There's something very mournful and tragic about it, but then core to the identity of the city is a place that's always faced existential threats, whether fires or plague or floods and hurricanes, for its entire history. That's the DNA of the place. So that's really stayed with me, and was a kind of new response. And then he mentioned this new house that he was renovating. I said, wait, hold on, like, you just bought a house? And he said he had. But that, to me, all of that together is sort of where we're at. We're trying to hold lots of competing ideas in one's mind.
Good.
Next.
Yes. I'm really interested in the point that was made about the Inflation Reduction Act money and ways that might be used. That could be positive or negative for our climate future, and how that money is used will really make a difference. There are proposals that will extend the life of the fossil fuel industry that are really moving quickly here. I heard Mr. Verchick talk about the importance of being ready. And unfortunately, industry is always a step ahead of community solutions. So industry is ready to roll. And when we have these forums and we talk in these like big generalities, people don't know the specifics and aren't able to engage in what is actually being proposed for this state. So I would like to ask Mr. Verchick to speak to some of the carbon sequestration, carbon pipeline, carbon capture and storage that is proposed that is going to be subsidized by the federal government and is moving at rapid pace here for development.
I'll just be very brief on that, but I think that is an issue. There are some things that at least in my view, could be funded that might prolong the fossil fuel industry. One of those things, in my view, is carbon capture and storage, which is the idea that you're using industry, you're creating ammonia for fertilizer, and then you're stripping out the CO2 and you're burying it underground in liquid form under high pressure forever. And it's not been ever used at scale for that purpose anywhere. And so, and the EJ communities, the communities in Cancer Alley and so on that would be around those pipelines are very concerned about it. The task force that I referred to has actually endorsed a plan for that, has as the governor, as you probably know. And the Biden administration also is very interested in directing money toward carbon capture and storage. And the idea in the state would be for it to become a hub, sort of a storage for all of carbon waste in half or a third of the country. And one of the things I'll suggest is that I myself have been working with the group Center for Progressive Reform, and there are many other groups that are trying to learn more about the law and the policy and the science of that in order to inform communities that are really interested in that. I'm skeptical of it. I've written a white paper explaining why I'm skeptical of it. But it's just people are going to have different opinions about things, and it's got to be debated. But the key is that everybody has to have good information. And the one thing to know is I was really surprised at how little that's going to move the needle on our carbon footprint. I mean, less than, I don't know, 5 or 3%. We spend 80% of our time, it seems, in the news talking about carbon capture and storage, and yet it's, even as advertised, it's less than 5% of the solution. So we really need to work on other things.
I think I read a column saying that recently by one Bob Marshall. I have many questions, but one is Governor John Bel Edwards, you serve on his task force, Democrat leaving office. He said a couple years ago that he hoped to get his climate initiatives far enough along before he leaves so that his successor could not undo them. Is that going to happen? And I'm also wondering, we have this governor race, we have most of the prominent candidates are Republicans. Is there a way that you would suggest kind of talking about this, asking about this, that does not immediately get at the partisan divide that always seems to come up?
Yeah, you're talking to a guy who was in the Obama administration, and what I was trying to do at EPA, along with everyone else, is sort of build structures that couldn't be reversed. Right? And so that's government, right? When you're working at least at the executive, I actually think there are things. One, I mean, money helps a lot, and so when the Biden administration is directing tens of billions of dollars, it's going to be going to projects all over the country related to resilience and related to reducing greenhouse gases. That's got people's attention in Louisiana. And one of the things we're doing on the task force is like looking for ways to bring as much money as we can into the state, because then it's going to be really hard to say we don't care about climate change. And I think educating voters, I think, is really important. I don't think this is necessarily a partisan issue. I mean, I think that we can find a governor, right, of whichever party, who at least can buy into some of these things. But I think you're right. We have to be very aware of that issue. Yeah.
We've got 5 minutes left.
Well, she just took my question, which has to do, I'm actually on one of the subcommittees of the Governor's Task Force.
I know.
And I think it's fantastic. It's very heartening to see that we now have established by statute, but indeed, the unraveling of it, which brings me back to, I was the board chair for CRCL when the first master plan came out, and yet we're now just starting the diversion. So there is a long-term, we all benefit, but there is a short-term displacement. And what's the solution to educating those that might have to change where they do their oysters?
You've written
or where
about
they do
that.
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, briefly, I'll just say the state has figured out a pretty good way of talking about massive climate projects like the diversion, which is, I think, the largest climate change mitigation infrastructure project in the world, which is that they don't use the words climate change ever to talk about it. And that's why it has almost unanimous support, although there's an asterisk there. But yeah, I've written about the diversions a lot, and the longest chapter of Second Nature is about the diversions, and it's about these questions that even the most sort of prudent plans, utilitarian plans, create. One is where it's, introducing these massive diversions into the swamp, into this fragile swamp area, while it will help to bring back the swamp, it will destroy the fisheries of the people who are there. Now, new fisheries will come in, yes. If nothing happens, those fishermen won't have land to stand on anyway in 10 years. But go down there and talk to the fishermen and say, tell them, make those arguments to them. You'll get, punched in the face, because they don't care about 10 years from now. They don't care about 50 years from now. They care about this next year. They've invested an enormous amount of their money into a certain kind of shrimp boat or fishing boat, into their gear, into an expertise, and their community, as they see it, is completely threatened by these diversions. And I think it's easy for us to say here, like, of course we have to do this. But there's a moral question that's raised. I mean, I've written a lot about Ironton as well on the other bank, which is descendants of a plantation, and they've just suffered the most brutal forms of environmental racism the entire, since the Civil War. They didn't have running water until 1980. They're surrounded by industry now, and the diversion, sure enough, the site chosen for that diversion on the West Bank goes right by Ironton. Now, they're not climate deniers. They understand, people in that community understand that the marsh is endangered, and that they get flooded every time there's a storm. But there's a good question to be at. You have to take seriously the question, well, why are you building it in our backyard? Like, really, you couldn't, there's nowhere else here that the fluviologist, could have earmarked. And so I think even in these sort of most successful cases, you create very difficult moral challenges, and there's not a silver bullet. There's not, these people don't want to, on both banks, don't necessarily want to be paid off. They want justice.
Last question.
Thank you. Hello, Professor Verchick and panel. So there are movements, particularly of young people, that are demanding radical action against climate change, protesting pipelines and deforestation, asking for, not waiting on movements around the globe, not waiting on governments to act, but really demanding radical action and taking intervention into their own hands. These movements, I'm thinking now, as we speak in Atlanta, the forest defenders have been labeled as domestic terrorists, and this is, an escalation of a long history of criminalizing environmental activists. How do you see sort of this this playing out, the sociological impacts, and intersecting with your work at all?
Well, I'll just say that I interviewed several younger people, I'll call them, I guess, people who were at the age of high school when I was writing the book, or even a little bit younger. And I am absolutely amazed at the kind of passion and ingenuity and creativity they have, and they are not afraid of anything. So I was very encouraged by that, particularly when you hear in the press that, that this generation is depressed or inactive, or, those kinds of things. I can't speak for all of those movements. I don't think that violence is an answer to anything. You haven't implied that any of this is violent, but I draw the line there for sure. But I think that, I think we need that anger if it's directed in a positive way. I also think that people in my generation need to find ways to work with those with those groups. They're mad. They're mad at us, and I get it, you know. But we have to find a way to work together on those. But I like that movement.
Well, thank you all for coming. That's all of our time. And also, our authors will be signing books where?
Peterson.
Across the street.
Right across the street. Thank you again.